Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we uncover America's most haunting forgotten stories. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a chilling tale from the past. Quick question: where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now step back with us to East Texas, 1899, and the tragic story of the Yates family asterisk. The year was 1899, and the rolling hills of East Texas were draped in a quiet that felt almost sacred. The Yates family farm lay tucked between two ancient oak groves, the kind that had stood there long before the first settlers came, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky as if keeping watch over the land. It was a land of hard labor and humble dreams, where families carved their lives out of red clay soil, and the wind whispered through the fields like a patient storyteller. To any passerby, the Yates homestead looked ordinary, simple, weathered, but orderly. The farmhouse, a modest wooden structure, had a porch wide enough for rocking chairs, and smoke from the chimney drifted lazily into the morning sky. 5 children lived there, their laughter mingling with the low hum of the countryside. Sarah, just shy of 10, with a curiosity that could turn a simple walk into an adventure. Thomas, 12, strong and protective, already carrying the air of someone older than his years. Little Annie, only 7, whose small hands were always smeared with flour or dirt from the garden. John, a spirited 9-year-old with a stubborn streak, and baby Mary, barely 4, who slept in a crib near the warmth of the kitchen stove. Their mother, Elizabeth, was a woman of quiet strength, who could soothe a fevered brow and mend torn clothing with equal ease. Their father, Samuel, was a man whose calloused hands spoke of years in the fields, a man who knew the rhythms of the earth better than any clock. Life was not easy, but it was simple. The Yates family rose with the sun, tilled their small fields, tended to livestock, and in the evenings gathered around a wooden table to share whatever food the land had offered. On Sunday, they walked to the small chapel in the neighboring town, a mile away over dirt roads and through the swaying tall grass, carrying with them the scent of fresh bread and the faint tang of livestock. Their neighbors knew them as honest, hard-working folk, quiet and polite, with no enemies worth mentioning. And yet, even in such places, shadows can gather where one least expects them. It began subtly, as these tragedies often do. There were signs small, almost dismissible, if anyone had cared to notice. The hens in the yard, usually clucking contentedly, were found dead on more than one morning, their feathers scattered like confetti. Tools would vanish from the shed, only to reappear in strange corners of the farm. The children whispered of strange noises at night, soft footfalls on the porch, shadows flitting across the windows, the faint smell of smoke that never came from the chimney. Elizabeth dismissed these fears at first. She was a mother, after all, and she believed that children's imaginations often turned harmless creaks and rustles into monsters. But Thomas had begun to speak of a figure he saw beyond the edge of the oak grove, always at dusk, never close enough to identify, yet always present. Samuel, practical and grounded, tried to quell his own unease. He told himself it was the work of animals or the tricks of light and shadow. Yet there were nights he woke to find the front door ajar, even though he had bolted it before bed, and footprints, bare, small, and oddly human-pressed into the soft earth outside. Something was intruding, creeping into the life of the Yates family, and yet no one could say who or why. The surrounding town had its share of stories. Of course, tales whispered in low voices at the general store or around the fire of the blacksmith's forge. Tales of a drifter who had been seen lingering near farms, of a man who vanished into the woods only to appear miles away with no memory of the journey. Stories like these were dismissed by most, but in the still hours before dawn, Elizabeth would sometimes lie awake, a chill running down her spine, and wonder if such stories might find their way to her doorstep. One late September evening, when the sky was painted in bruised purples and oranges, and the cicadas sang their relentless song, the first truly alarming event occurred. It was Sarah who noticed it first. She had been playing near the edge of the orchard, tossing a small leather ball to herself, when she caught sight of a figure standing beyond the trees. At first, she thought it was Thomas, come to fetch her for supper, but the figure did not move like him. It was still, almost statuesque, and as the light dimmed, Sarah felt an unfamiliar fear curl in her chest. She ran, calling to her mother, her voice trembling as she recounted the sight. Elizabeth reassured her with a soft hug, pressing a hand to her daughter's forehead, but the unease had already taken root. That night, the family sat closer together in the small living room, listening to the wind and the distant call of a lone owl. Days passed, and the tension grew. Objects in the home shifted inexplicably, and the children's nervous glances toward. The shadows became more pronounced. Neighbors, when asked, reported seeing strange lights flickering in the Yates orchard at Knightsmore, dancing glimmers, like lanterns carried by unseen hands. Samuel and Elizabeth, now both anxious and vigilant, began taking turns watching over the family while the other slept. The farm, once a sanctuary of labor and laughter, had become a place where even daylight could not fully dispel the sense of dread. Then, one fateful night, it all came to a horrifying head. The family had retired to bed, weary from a long day of chores, when the silence of the house was shattered by a violent pounding on the front door. Samuel, already tense from weeks of unease, leapt from his bed and grabbed a lantern, moving cautiously toward the sound. Elizabeth followed, holding Mary close, while the older children huddled together on the floor, eyes wide with fear. When Samuel flung open the door, no one was there, only the cold night air and the faint, eerie smell of smoke that had become familiar over the past weeks. Footprints in the mud led from the porch toward the grove, then disappeared entirely. Samuel, angry and afraid, returned inside and bolted the door, but sleep fled from the household that night. They huddled together, listening, waiting, wondering if the figure they had glimpsed from the orchard had returned. By the following week, the unease had reached a fever pitch. The children were jumpy. Elizabeth's hands shook as she prepared meals, and Samuel walked the perimeter of the farm each evening, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. Something unseen watched them, learning their routines, testing the walls they had built around their lives. And then, on a morning that began like any other, the horror revealed itself. The Yates farmhouse, a place of warmth, laughter, and family, had become a tomb. Neighbors arriving to deliver morning bread and milk found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke and the scent of burnt wood. And then they saw the bodies, 5 small, innocent lives extinguished in a silence that spoke, louder than any scream. Sarah, Thomas, Annie, John, and little Mary all gone. Their mother and father nowhere to be seen. The town was thrown into a frenzy. People whispered of murder, of a terrible intruder, of something beyond explanation. Sheriff deputies combed the nearby woods and fields, but there was no trace, no sign of a struggle beyond the farmhouse. The Yates family had vanished from history, leaving only charred remains and a question that would linger in the minds of the townsfolk for decades. Who or what had ended the lives of these 5 innocents, and why? Even as the investigation began, strange rumors spread. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving through the trees at night, carrying figures from the farmhouse. Others spoke of a man with piercing eyes who had been seen near the Yates property weeks before the tragedy, then disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. Whatever the truth, the silence left behind was deafening. The story of the Yates family became one of those dark tales that parents would whisper to children as a warning. A tale of caution that lingered in the air of the Texas hills. A tragedy that defied logic, yet demanded remembrance. And so, the Yates family became a ghostly echo in the rolling hills. A reminder that even in the quietest corners of America, horror could strike, leaving only questions, memories, and a silence that would never be broken. The story of that September night in 1899 would travel through generations, whispered in corners of old towns, recorded in faded newspapers, and preserved in the collective memory of a community that could never forget the silent death of 5 innocents. The news of the Yates children's deaths spread through the East Texas countryside like wildfire, carried first by the few neighbors close enough to witness the horror, then by word of mouth through the nearby towns, and finally printed in the faded ink of local newspapers. The front page accounts were short, stark, and chilling. 5 children found dead under mysterious circumstances. Parents missing, no leads. Local law enforcement baffled. Yet the cold facts of print could not capture the atmosphere of dread that settled over the small town. Houses were shuttered earlier than usual, doors bolted in fear, and families kept their children close, wary of shadows in the night. Every rustle of the wind through the trees, every flicker of candlelight, became a potential omen. Sheriff James Harlow was a man of experience, a figure whose hat had seen more sunrises over these dusty roads than most could remember. Yet even he approached the Yates case with a careful wariness that betrayed his usually unshakable demeanor. When he arrived at the homestead, he surveyed the scene with eyes trained to notice detail. The burned remains of the fireplace, smoldering. Embers that hinted someone had tried to destroy evidence. The children's small shoes neatly placed near the doorway, as if arranged by a meticulous hand. Faint scratches on the wooden floor, too small to belong to an adult. It was a scene that spoke of chaos, yet at the same time of deliberate control. Whoever had done this knew the family intimately, or had watched them for weeks, perhaps months, learning every habit and weakness. Harlow sent deputies into the surrounding woods to search for footprints or other signs, but the ground, soft from recent rain, yielded little. The trail of footprints observed by Samuel days before had seemingly vanished into thin air. Old-timers in town suggested that such disappearances were the work of wanderers, vagrants, trappers, or outlaws. There had been no reports of strangers lingering near the homestead. The Yates were well-liked, quiet, and unassuming. No one had reason to harm them, or so it seemed. Meanwhile, the townsfolk gathered in hushed groups, speculating and fearing. Mrs. Caldwell, the miller's wife, swore she had seen lights moving in the orchard the night before the tragedy, ghostly and flickering, almost like lanterns floating without hands. Mr. Boone, a rancher, whispered that he had glimpsed a shadowy figure in the woods weeks prior, staring at the farmhouse for hours, before disappearing behind the trees. The town's schoolteacher, Miss Larkin, suggested the children's deaths might have been caused by a wild animal, perhaps a pack of feral dogs or a mountain lion, but the scorched fireplace, the organized arrangement of the children's shoes, and the complete absence of defensive wounds or claw marks rendered such theories hollow. Investigators also considered darker possibilities: arson, robbery, vengeance. But the Yates family had no enemies, no money to steal, no disputes beyond the usual neighborly squabbles over fence lines and water rights. The absence of Samuel and Elizabeth only deepened the mystery. Had they fled? Had they been victims themselves? People asked these questions with trembling voices, but the answers were nowhere to be found. The sheriff even consulted neighboring counties, wondering if perhaps the Yates had wandered into the forest, lost or kidnapped, only to meet some unseen fate. Yet no trace of them emerged. As the investigation dragged on, the townsfolk began noticing other, subtler changes in their environment. Animals acted strangely, avoiding the Yates farm even after the bodies were removed. Dogs refused to enter the orchard, their hackles raised at invisible threats. Chickens hesitated near the burned farmhouse site. Some swore the trees themselves seemed different, heavier somehow, as though shadowed with lingering grief. Children in town began speaking quietly of dreams in which the Yates children appeared, pale and silent, beckoning toward the woods. In the candlelight of their homes, parents shushed these stories, but the unease remained. One particularly unnerving account came from the postman, who had delivered mail to the Yates home for years. He described hearing whispers from the orchard. On multiple occasions, faint but unmistakable, as though a crowd of children murmured just beyond the tree line. And then, most chillingly, he claimed to have seen movement in the windows of the empty farmhouse at night, curtains swaying as though someone invisible had brushed them, shadows passing in rooms that were supposed to be abandoned. The sheriff dismissed this as imagination or worse, hysteria, but these stories fueled a sense of creeping dread that no official report could erase in the weeks that followed. The town tried to carry on, but the memory of the Yates tragedy lingered like a persistent fog. Farmers reported strange noises while working in the fields. Neighbors swore that the wind carried distant cries at dusk, and some claimed to see fleeting figures among the trees, silhouettes that vanished when approached. People began leaving. Small tokens at the edge of the Yates property. Candles, flowers, scraps of cloth. Some thought these gestures might honor the children. Others believed they could appease some lingering force. Fear and superstition became intertwined, a tapestry of anxiety that blanketed the community. Sheriff Harlow, meanwhile, faced the limitations of law and reason. He questioned every person who had contact with the Yates family, yet no one provided leads. The local doctor, an older man with years of experience in matters both medical and moral, examined the remains and confirmed that the children had died quickly, without signs of struggle, disease, or prolonged suffering. It was almost as if they had been rendered unconscious, then left to die. This revelation horrified the sheriff and townsfolk alike. How could anyone commit such acts and vanish without leaving a trace? The conclusion was inescapable. This was no random act, no accident. Something calculated, patient, and chillingly deliberate had taken place. As autumn deepened, the investigation expanded, drawing the attention of newspapers in larger Texas cities. Reporters arrived, scribbling in notebooks, speaking to neighbors, and wandering the orchard where the tragedy had unfolded. Yet even they, outsiders with no personal connection to the land or the people, were unsettled. They described the farmhouse as oppressively silent, the trees as brooding sentinels, and the air itself as heavy with unspoken grief. Some left shaken, unwilling to return after dark. Others stayed longer than they intended, compelled by a morbid fascination with a horror that defied explanation. Meanwhile, strange occurrences persisted. Lights flickered in the abandoned farmhouse at night, disappearing when approached. Footprints appeared in fresh mud around the garage. Orchard, some small, some impossibly large. Neighbors reported hearing laughter, a child's laughter, the faint, eerie echo of voices carrying across the fields at odd hours. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as imagination or grief, but the locals, shaped by decades of rural hardship and experience with the unforgiving land, knew that there were things in the world that could not be easily explained. By December of 1899, a chill settled over the town, both from the coming winter and from the unresolved terror of the Yates tragedy. Families stayed closer together, doors remained locked, and the subject of the Yates family became almost taboo in casual conversation. Yet, despite the fear, there was a strange persistence among some townsfolk, a desire to understand, to uncover the truth. Farmers scoured the woods. Children dared each other to approach the farmhouse ruins. and whispers of hidden clues circulated in secret gatherings. The question that hung over everyone like a thick fog was impossible to shake. What had happened? To Samuel and Elizabeth? Were they complicit, victims, or something else entirely? And who or what had so meticulously ended the lives of their 5 children? The deeper the town dug, the more the mystery seemed to twist, elude, and expand. The sheriff's notes filled volumes with observations, sketches, and collected testimony, yet none of it pointed to a resolution. Letters sent to distant relatives yielded no answers. Friends of the Yates family reported no unusual behavior prior to the tragedy. And while the charred farmhouse eventually crumbled under the weight of neglect, the memory of that night remained as vivid as the scorch marks on the wooden beams. Some began to speak quietly of curses, of unnatural forces inhabiting the land. Others clung to rational explanations, though their voices were tinged with doubt. And still the shadows lingered, stretching long across the fields at dusk, rustling through the trees, and leaving a silence that pressed into the bones of those who dared to remember. In the hearts and minds of the townsfolk, the Yates family, tragedy had become more than a story of death. It was a dark mirror, reflecting the fragility of life, the unknowable presence of danger, and the enduring ache of innocence lost. By the turn of the century, the tragedy of the Yates family had transformed from a shocking local event into a story whispered across the county, traveling along dusty roads and into the parlors of neighboring towns. Every year, as September rolled around, parents would glance nervously at their children playing near orchards or walking home alone from school. The memory of those 5 young lives extinguished lingered like a shadow, impossible to ignore, and the deeper the townsfolk looked, the stranger the story became. Sheriff Harlow, undeterred by the growing weight of speculation and superstition, began pursuing leads that were more tangible than whispers in the wind. He questioned itinerant workers, travelers along the dusty roads, and anyone who had been near the Yates property during the months preceding the massacre. One man, a carpenter who had recently passed through the county, recalled seeing a stranger, camped near the edge of the oak grove, a tall figure cloaked in shadow who vanished when approached. The sheriff was intrigued, but frustrated. The description was vague, and no one else could confirm it. Yet Harlow couldn't dismiss it entirely. Whoever had committed this atrocity had to be human, and the idea that someone had lurked unseen for weeks or months seemed plausible. Meanwhile, the townsfolk began speaking of other signs. Farmers claimed their animals reacted with fear near the site of the tragedy. The wind, they said, carried faint cries of children, almost as if the Yates children had imprinted themselves upon the land. Some reported glimpsing shadowy figures flitting just beyond the tree line, impossible to approach or identify. One local elder, a woman named Mrs. Whitcomb, insisted that the land was cursed, recalling stories passed down from her own grandmother about strange, unnatural happenings in the area long before the Yates family arrived. She spoke of disappearances and unexplainable deaths, always near the same stretch of oak groves that now bordered the Yates farm. Though many dismissed her as overly imaginative, her words added a layer of unease, making even the rationally minded consider the possibility of something beyond comprehension. As weeks turned into months, the mystery of Samuel and Elizabeth Yates became central to speculation. Had they been murdered before or after their children? Had they fled in terror or been driven to some unthinkable fate by forces unseen? Letters sent to relatives in other states returned unanswered. No trace of their movements was ever found. The sheriff theorized that perhaps they had been taken by a traveling criminal, someone who had marked the family for reasons no one could understand. Yet this theory, too, faltered under scrutiny. There was no evidence of robbery, no ransom notes, and no sightings of suspicious figures on the roads that connected their homestead to the nearest town. By spring, The farmhouse ruins had become a macabre pilgrimage site. Curiosity seekers from neighboring counties ventured into the orchard, often returning pale-faced, reporting the same unsettling phenomena: faint giggles, glimpses of small hands at windows, sudden chills, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Some even claimed to see fleeting figures resembling the children in the periphery of their vision, only to disappear when approached. The idea that the land itself held the tragedy became widespread, a story whispered over dinner tables. In the quiet corners of churches, locals began leaving offerings, small bouquets of wildflowers, candles, and scraps of cloth to honor the children, or perhaps to pacify whatever lingered in that grove dot in the months that followed. A strange figure appeared in town. He called himself Ezekiel Crane, a wandering preacher who claimed to have traveled across Texas and beyond, delivering sermons and offering guidance to the troubled. He had heard of the Yates tragedy and arrived quietly, seeking to comfort those who remained in mourning. Yet there was something unsettling about him. His eyes seemed to linger too long on the ruins of the Yates home, and he spoke often of forces that do not forgive and shadows that wait for unwary souls. Some townsfolk, desperate for answers, sought his counsel. Others, wary of his intensity, whispered that he brought with him more darkness than light. He conducted vigils near the orchard, speaking of prayers and protection, but even he could not explain what had happened, nor could he locate Samuel and Elizabeth. Rumors persisted that the Yates family had been targeted by someone with intimate knowledge of the home, someone who had observed their routines and waited for the perfect moment. The sheriff compiled profiles of local residents and drifters alike, seeking patterns or motives, but none fit. Men with past crimes in nearby counties were questioned. Travelers' logs were examined. Even wandering families were scrutinized. And yet, the deeper the investigation went, the more it seemed that the perpetrator was not simply another person. There was something calculated, almost meticulous, in the way the children were left, the house partially destroyed, and Samuel and Elizabeth entirely vanished. By midsummer, speculation evolved into folklore. Stories told in hushed tones in the town saloons and general stores began to blur the line between fact and myth. Some claimed that the children had been spirited away by supernatural means, that the grove itself had claimed them. Others insisted that a lone madman had committed the act, a presence that haunted the land even after his disappearance. Travelers passing through the county reported strange, inexplicable occurrences on the roads leading to the Yates property. Sudden chills, strange animal behavior, even brief glimpses of figures resembling the lost children walking silently along the roadside. Even the sheriff, a man grounded in law and reason, could not deny the oddities. Logs of his patrols mentioned glimpses of lights in the ruins at night, footprints in mud with no corresponding visitor, and unexplained sounds that echoed across the empty fields. Harlow began documenting every anomaly meticulously, recording each story, each witness account, and each odd occurrence. But even with this diligence, the case remained unsolved. Each detail seemed to lead to more questions than answers, and the deeper he delved, the more the tragedy of the Yates family refused to yield its secrets. By the end of the year, the landscape itself seemed to mourn. The oak groves surrounding the Yates homestead grew heavier with shadow. The soil seemed darker, and the breeze carried a lingering sorrow. Children in the surrounding town no longer ventured into the orchard. Adults avoided the ruins, crossing the road or taking longer routes home. The Yates tragedy became a lesson whispered in cautious tones. The world could be cruel, inexplicable, and relentless, and innocence could vanish in a single night, leaving a silence that haunted generations. And yet, despite months of speculation, investigation, and fearful storytelling, the central question persisted, echoing through the empty fields and abandoned orchard. What had become of Samuel and Elizabeth Yates? The children were gone. That much was known, but their parents. Fate remained a void of mystery that gnawed at the town's collective conscience, a wound that would never fully heal. The community, now living with the shadow of that September night, could only speculate, clinging to folklore, rumors, and the faint hope that one day the truth might emerge. The Yates family tragedy had become more than a crime. It was a presence, a haunting in the Texas hills, a whisper in the wind, and a shadow over the hearts of all who remembered. And as the seasons changed, as crops were planted and harvested, and as children played near the edge of the trees, that shadow lingered, silent, unyielding, and impossible to forget. The years following the Yates tragedy were marked by a quiet unease that settled over the town like a persistent fog. The orchard where the children had played, once vibrant and full of life, became overgrown, its paths choked with weeds and brambles. The ruins of the farmhouse slowly succumbed to time, the charred beams rotting and collapsing. Yet the site never lost its air of something unfinished, something waiting to be understood. Locals continued to avoid it, crossing the road or altering their paths just to keep distance. For the memory of the children and the unexplained disappearance of Samuel and Elizabeth still clung to the landowed Sheriff Harlow, though aged and weary. From the relentless pursuit of answers, never stopped his investigation entirely. He kept meticulous journals filled with witness accounts, sketches of footprints, and notes on odd occurrences, convinced that someday some clue would emerge to shed light on the tragedy. Yet each new lead brought only frustration. People moved. In and out of the county, witnesses passed away, and physical evidence slowly disappeared. Even the wandering preacher, Ezekiel Crane, eventually left, claiming the land carried its own judgment, a force beyond human comprehension. His departure left the town with his warnings echoing in their minds. The unseen watches. The earth remembers. Some sins leave scars that time cannot heal. Stories of the Yates family became legend, told in low voices around hearths on lawn. Winter nights. Children were warned never to venture near the orchard, never to wander alone at dusk, and parents held their own children a little closer than necessary. Yet, despite the fear, there was also a lingering sorrow that could not be ignored. Neighbors who had once walked past the Yates, home without a thought, now remembered the small lives that had been lost, 5 children whose laughter had been stolen, and 2 parents whose fate remained a mystery. Their absence became a permanent shadow over the community, a reminder of life's fragility and the horrors that could strike without warning. Over time, theories emerged, some rational, some steeped in superstition. Some believed a drifter, a madman passing through the area, had targeted the family, meticulously planning and executing his crime before vanishing into the forests of East Texas. Others, less willing to trust reason, spoke of darker forces, curses, spirits, or a malevolent presence in the grove that had claimed the children and perhaps their parents as well. The truth, if it could ever be known, remained just out of reach, obscured by the passage of time and the fading memories of those who had witnessed the horror firsthand. The local newspapers occasionally revisited the tragedy, usually on anniversaries of that fateful September, recounting the known facts and the unanswered questions. Each retelling revived the uneasy fascination and sorrow. As readers imagined the children's innocence abruptly ended, the parents vanished, and the community left to wrestle with grief and fear. The Yates family had become emblematic of unexplained tragedy, a story that resonated far beyond the borders of East Texas, reaching those who understood that life on the frontier, while full of hope and hard work, could also be merciless and inexplicable. In the decades that followed, the land slowly healed in a physical sense. The orchard grew wild, the oak groves thickened, and nature reclaimed the site. Yet for those who knew the story, the site never felt ordinary. Travelers reported still feeling unease when passing by, a chill in the air, or the sensation of unseen eyes. Children who grew up hearing the story would sometimes wake with the sense of being watched, and adults would glance nervously toward the overgrown fields, as if the past might rise again at any moment. The Yates tragedy also left a deeper imprint on the community itself. People became more vigilant, more protective of their children, and more aware of the fragile line between safety and danger. In conversations at the general store, the church, and around kitchen tables, neighbors would speak of the event with quiet reverence, acknowledging the pain of loss while reminding themselves to guard against the unpredictable nature of the world. And yet, the unanswered questions lingered. What had happened to Samuel and Elizabeth? Had they perished alone with their children, or had they disappeared into some unknowable fate? The lack of closure allowed the story to grow in the collective imagination, as each retelling added layers of fear, sorrow, and speculation. By the early 20th century, new generations were born, unaware of the faces and voices of the five innocents. Lost in 1899, yet the story endured, passed down through families, recorded in diaries, and occasionally retold in local newspapers. The names Sarah, Thomas, Annie, John, and Mary Yates became symbols of childhood innocence tragically cut short. The Yates family tragedy remained an indelible part of the county's history, a haunting reminder that even in a simple, hard-working life, horror could arrive without warning, leaving only silence in its wake. Even today, when travelers pass through that stretch of East Texas, the shadow of the Yates family seems to linger. The orchard stands wild and unkempt, the remnants of the farmhouse long gone, yet the stories endure, whispered in the wind, carried along by those who remember or have heard the tale. In the quiet moments of dusk, when the sun casts long shadows through the trees, it is said that the land itself seems to mourn. Some claim to see the fleeting forms of children playing among the oaks, hear laughter that fades before it can be fully heard, or feel a coldness that has no earthly source. The tragedy of the Yates family remains a testament to the fragility of life, the unpredictable cruelty that can strike even the most ordinary and unsuspecting homes, and the enduring weight of loss. 5 young lives silenced forever, and 2 parents who vanished without a trace. A town left to grapple with grief and unanswered questions. A story that continues to chill the hearts of those who hear it. A shadow of the past that refuses to be forgotten. In the end, the silent death of the Yates family is more than a story of loss. It is a reminder that history holds not only triumph and growth, but also sorrow and mystery. And in the rolling hills of East Texas, the wind still whispers of 5 innocents lost, carrying their memory through the trees, through the fields, and into the hearts of all who remember.